suitcase resting between us like a coffin for my former life. Margaret Chen, my attorney for the past 18 months, scrolled through her tablet with the resigned expression of someone who had delivered bad news too many times to feel it anymore. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. David, I need you to understand what's about to happen in there, she said, her voice low enough that the couple arguing 3 benches down couldn't hear. Judge Morrison has reviewed the prenuptial agreement. It's airtight. The mansion, the vacation property in Sedona, the investment portfolio, it all reverts to Vanessa. Your name was never on the deed. I stared at my hands. Carpenter's hands, my father used to call them. Rough, capable, built for creating things. For 15 years, those hands had renovated every inch of that mansion. The Italian marble in the foyer that Vanessa had insisted upon, the custom oak banisters I'd carved myself, the sunroom where she practiced yoga while I was at work. I transformed that house from a dated 1920s estate into something worthy of Architectural Digest. And now, according to the law, I had no claim to any of it. What about the business? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Margaret's pause told me everything. Sullivan and Morrison Construction is solely in your name, so that's protected. But Vanessa's legal team is arguing that her family's initial investment 12 years ago entitles them to 40% of its current value. Given that the company's worth approximately $8 million now, and her father invested $200,000. That was a loan, I said, my voice sharper than intended. Richard told me it was a loan. I paid back every cent with interest. Do you have documentation of that repayment? The silence between us was answer enough. Richard Hartwell, my soon-to-be former father-in-law, had waved away my attempts at formal paperwork. We were family, he'd said. Family didn't need contracts and lawyers. Just trust. Trust. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. A bailiff emerged from the courtroom, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Chun and Hartwell parties. Judge Morrison is ready. The courtroom smelled of old wood and broken promises. Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Gerald Rosenberg, a man whose hourly rate could feed a family of 4 for a month. She wore a navy suit I'd bought her for our 10th anniversary. Irony wasn't dead, apparently. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she didn't look at me as I took my seat across the aisle. After 15 years of marriage, I'd become invisible to her. Behind Vanessa sat her father, Richard Hartwell. 72 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of distinguished presence that came from 3 generations of old money. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. When I'd first met him, I was a 28-year-old contractor with more ambition than capital, and he'd looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog his daughter had dragged home, wary but willing to see what happened. What happened was that I'd loved his daughter with everything I had, built her dream house, supported her through 2 miscarriages and the depression that followed, held her when her mother died 5 years ago, and somewhere in all that building and holding and loving, she'd decided I wasn't enough. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a pearl chain, surveyed both parties with the weariness of someone who'd overseen too many divorces to believe in happy endings. Let's proceed efficiently, shall we? Mr. Rosenberg, I've reviewed the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties on June 14, 2009. The terms are clear regarding property division. Do you have anything to add to your client's position? Rosenberg stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Your Honor, Mrs. Hartwell Sullivan requests full ownership of the marital residence at 1847 Blackwood Estate Drive, valued at $6.2 million, as stipulated in the prenuptial agreement. Additionally, we're seeking fair compensation for the Hartwell family's investment in Sullivan and Morrison Construction, which has appreciated significantly due in part to connections and contracts facilitated by Mr. Richard Hartwell's business network. My jaw clenched. Connections and contracts. As if the 16-hour days, the calluses, the times I'd personally swung a hammer alongside my crew to meet impossible deadlines. As if none of that mattered. It was the Hartwell name that built my company, apparently. Not my hands. Not my vision. Margaret stood. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan does not contest the property division as outlined in the prenuptial agreement. However, the characterization of Mr. Hartwell's $200,000 payment as an investment is misleading. It was a personal loan, fully repaid with interest over a 5-year period through informal cash payments. Mr. Sullivan's business success is attributable to his own skill, work ethic, and reputation in the construction industry. Do you have evidence of these repayments? Judge Morrison asked. We have bank withdrawal records corresponding to the alleged payment dates, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she knew how weak that sounded. Cash payments. No paper trail. The kind of casual arrangement that happens between family members who trust each other. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. I watched my marriage dissolve into legal terminology, watched 15 years reduced to asset distribution and liability assessment. Vanessa spoke only once, when the judge asked if she wished to address the court. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. Your Honor, I entered this marriage in good faith. I supported my husband's dreams and ambitions. But over the years, he became married to his work, not to me. The house, our house, became just another project to him. I was alone in that mansion more nights than I was with my husband. This isn't about money. It's about recognizing what I gave up, what I endured, and ensuring I can move forward with dignity. I wanted to stand up, to shout that I'd worked those hours for us, for the life she wanted, for the security she demanded. But Margaret's hand on my arm kept me seated, and I watched Vanessa dab at her eyes with a tissue as if she were the victim in all this. Judge Morrison delivered her ruling at 3:47 p.m. The mansion belonged to Vanessa, as did the Sedona property and the majority of our joint investment portfolio. I kept my business, my truck, and the apartment I'd been renting for the past year. The judge found insufficient evidence to support the Hartwell family's claim on my company, which was the only victory in a day of defeats. This court is adjourned, Judge Morrison said, and the gavel's crack felt like a door slamming on everything I'd built. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming. Margaret reviewed next steps, paperwork to sign, timelines for property access, the mechanics of uncoupling a life. I barely heard her. My mind was back in that mansion, in the library where Vanessa and I used to read on Sunday mornings, in the kitchen where I'd learned to make her mother's lasagna recipe, in the bedroom where we'd whispered plans for children who never came. David, Margaret's voice pulled me back. You need to collect your personal belongings from the house within 30 days. After that, you'll need Vanessa's permission to enter the property. I'd recommend going sooner rather than later. I nodded, thinking of the tools in the garage, the photo albums in the attic, the drawings of buildings I'd never construct. Thinking of how you dismantle a life piece by piece. Mr. Sullivan. I turned. Richard Hartwell stood 10 feet away, near a black Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's homes. He wore a charcoal overcoat despite the mild November weather, and his expression was unreadable. Behind him, Vanessa was already in the car, staring at her phone. Richard, I said, because even now, even after everything, I couldn't bring myself to be rude to the man who'd welcomed me into his family. He walked closer, and I noticed things I'd never seen before. The slight tremor in his left hand, the weight he'd lost, the way his collar sat loose around his neck. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, as if the divorce had aged him too. I need to speak with you, he said quietly. Not here, not now, but soon. I don't think that's a good idea, Margaret interjected, stepping between us with the protective instinct of a good attorney. Mr. Hartwell, any communication should go through legal channels. Richard didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on mine, and there was something in them I couldn't quite name. Regret? Urgency? Something else entirely? David, please. It's important. It's about. He paused, glancing back at the Mercedes where Vanessa was waiting. It's about things you don't know. Things I should have told you years ago. Mr. Hartwell, I strongly advise. Margaret began, but I held up my hand. When? I asked. Tomorrow. Noon. The coffee shop on Merchant Street, the one near your old office. Just you and me. Before I could respond, before Margaret could protest further, Richard pressed something into my hand. A business card, expensive cardstock, his name embossed in gold. But when I flipped it over, there were 3 words written in his distinctive handwriting, the letters shaky and urgent. Trust me once. He walked back to his car without another word. The Mercedes pulled away, carrying my ex-wife and her father toward a life I was no longer part of, leaving me standing in the courthouse parking lot with questions and a business card that felt impossibly heavy in my palm. "David, you don't have to meet with him," Margaret said. "Whatever he wants to say, it can go through official channels. You don't owe that family anything anymore." She was right. I didn't owe them anything. But as I watched the Mercedes disappear around the corner, I thought about Richard's trembling hand, the way he'd looked at me like he was carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. Those 3 words on the back of his business card. Trust me once. I trusted the Hartwells before. Trusted their word over contracts. Trusted their promises of family. And that trust had cost me everything. My home, my marriage, 15 years of my life reduced to a legal proceeding and a judge's gavel. But something in Richard's eyes haunted me as I drove back to my rented apartment. A 1-bedroom place that smelled like old carpet and other people's cooking. Something desperate and urgent and profoundly sad. I set the business card on my kitchen counter, next to the takeout containers from 3 different restaurants and a bottle of bourbon I'd been working through for the past week. The words stared up at me. A plea or a promise or maybe both. Tomorrow at noon, I'd find out which. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the single armchair my apartment came furnished with. A thing upholstered in a color somewhere between beige and surrender, and thought about the man I used to be. 28 years old, hungry, fearless. I'd grown up in Riverside, the son of a mechanic and a nurse, and I'd learned early that nothing came free in this world. My father spent 40 years under car hoods, came home every night smelling like motor oil and manual labor, and died at 63 with exactly $11,000 in his savings account. My mother worked double shifts at Mercy General, her scrubs always pristine even when exhaustion made her hands shake as she counted pills. They taught me that work was dignity, that if you built something with your own hands, no one could take it from you. They were wrong about that last part. I started Sullivan Construction when I was 25, with a used truck and a toolbox my father left me. 3 employees, all of them guys I'd worked with on other crews. Miguel, who could frame a house faster than anyone I'd ever seen. Danny, whose electrical work was so precise it was practically art. And James, who'd been my best friend since high school and whose loyalty was the one thing I'd never had to question. Those first years were brutal. We took jobs other contractors wouldn't touch. The renovations in neighborhoods where you needed to watch your equipment, the projects with impossible deadlines, the clients who thought budget-friendly meant free. I worked 18-hour days, slept in my truck between jobs, lived on coffee and gas station sandwiches and the stubborn belief that if I just worked hard enough, if I built things well enough, success would follow. And it did. Slowly at first, then faster. Word spread. The guy who shows up on time. The crew that doesn't cut corners. The contractor who treats your home like it's his own. By the time I met Vanessa, I was 30, and Sullivan Construction was becoming something real. Not just a hustle anymore, but a business. We had an office, a secretary, contracts with property management companies. I was hiring, expanding, dreaming bigger. I met her at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital. She was there with her father, wearing a silver dress that caught the light every time she moved. And I was there because one of my clients had bought a table and insisted I attend. I didn't belong in that world. Men in tuxedos talking about stock portfolios and vacation homes in Europe. But Vanessa found me at the bar, smiled and said, "You look as uncomfortable as I feel." That was the first lie I realized now. She was never uncomfortable in that world. She was born for it, raised in it, shaped by it. But I'd been too dazzled to notice. We dated for 2 years. She loved that I was different from the men in her social circle, the trust fund boys and corporate lawyers and hedge fund managers who saw her as a prize to be won. I was real, she said, authentic, grounded. I built things instead of just moving money around. Her father was skeptical at first. I could see it in the way he assessed me at family dinners, asking questions about my business plan, my growth projections, my 5-year goals. Testing me. But I must have passed because 6 months before the wedding, he invited me to his study, all dark wood and leather and the smell of expensive cigars, and offered me the loan. 200,000, Richard said, swirling scotch in a crystal glass. Interest-free. Consider it an investment in my future son-in-law. You've got talent, David, and vision. But talent and vision need capital to become legacy. I should have gotten it in writing, should have insisted on contracts and lawyers and clear terms. But I'd been young and grateful and desperate to prove I belonged in this family. So I'd shaken his hand, thanked him, and promised I'd pay back every cent. And I had. Over 5 years, I'd given him cash payments, 20,000 here, 30,000 there, always personally, usually at family dinners or holiday gatherings. Richard would wave it away at first, say it wasn't necessary, but I'd insist. I'd grown up watching my father work himself to death to avoid owing anyone anything. Debt was a chain and I wouldn't be chained. But cash leaves no trail. And trust, I learned, is just another word for naivety when lawyers get involved. The apartment was cold. I got up, checked the thermostat, set to 68, same as always, and realized the chill was inside me. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon, then poured them back into the bottle. I needed to be clear-headed tomorrow. Midnight became 1 a.m., became 2 a.m. I thought about Vanessa, about when things had started to break between us. Was it after the second miscarriage? When I'd held her in that hospital room, both of us crying, and she'd whispered, "Maybe we're not meant to be parents?" Was it when her mother died, and she'd retreated into herself so completely that I couldn't reach her no matter how hard I tried? Or was it simpler than that? Was it just the slow erosion of 2 people who wanted different things, who'd built a life on a foundation that looked solid until you actually tested it? I remembered the fights, her standing in our bedroom, her bedroom now, saying, "You care more about your business than you do about me." Me, exhausted after a 70-hour week, snapping back, "I'm doing this for us." Her shaking her head. "No, David, you're doing this for you. You're trying to prove something to my father, to yourself, to everyone. But you never asked what I actually wanted." What had she wanted? I still didn't know. At 3 a.m., I opened my laptop and looked up the address of the mansion. Google Maps showed it from above, that sprawling estate with its gated entrance, circular driveway, and manicured grounds. I zoomed in, recognizing every detail. The pool house I'd rebuilt after the harsh winter of 2019. The greenhouse where Vanessa had grown orchids for 1 summer before losing interest. The 3-car garage where I'd kept my work truck, tools, and the vintage motorcycle I'd restored as a surprise for our 10th anniversary. A gift she'd smiled at politely and never ridden. I put so much of myself into that house. Not just labor, but dreams. I'd imagined our children running through those halls. Imagined growing old with Vanessa in the master bedroom with its view of the garden. Imagined holidays with grandchildren opening presents under the Christmas tree in the living room with the fireplace I'd rebuilt stone by stone. Dreams are expensive. Sometimes they cost more than money. At dawn, I finally slept and dreamed of houses I'd never build. The coffee shop on Merchant Street was called the Daily Grind, and it was the kind of place that served artisanal pour-overs and had mismatched furniture that was somehow all perfectly coordinated. I'd been going there for years, back when my office was 2 blocks away, before I moved to a larger space on the east side of town. I arrived at 11:45 a.m., ordered a black coffee I didn't want, and took a table in the back corner where I could watch the door. Old habit from job sites, always know your exits, always see who's coming. Richard arrived at 11:58 a.m. He ordered something complicated, a cappuccino with oat milk, specific temperature, and the barista knew his name. Of course she did. Richard Hartwell probably owned the building this coffee shop occupied. He looked worse in daylight than he had outside the courthouse. The tremor in his left hand was more pronounced, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He sat down across from me, wrapped both hands around his coffee cup as if trying to absorb its warmth, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. "You said it was important." "It is." He paused, staring into his coffee like it might contain answers. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Did you ever look at the deed to the house? The actual property deed. The question caught me off guard. Why would I? Vanessa and I were married. I didn't need to. But did you? No, I admitted. The prenup said the house was in her name, and I signed it. We were getting married. I trusted that everything was. I trusted you. Both of you. Richard closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were wet. Not crying, not quite, but close. I made a mistake, David. Terrible mistake. And I'm afraid I've let it go on too long, out of cowardice, maybe, or misplaced loyalty, or stupidity. My heart started beating faster. What are you talking about? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times. He set it on the table between us but didn't push it toward me yet. 15 years ago, when you and Vanessa got engaged, I had my lawyers draw up the prenuptial agreement. Standard stuff for families like ours. Protect the assets, ensure clean division if things went south. The house was to be solely in Vanessa's name. That was always the plan. I know all this, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. I was there, Richard. I signed the papers. But do you know why I insisted on it? He leaned forward. Do you know why I was so adamant that the deed stay in her name alone? I shrugged. To protect your family's assets. To make sure if I turned out to be a gold digger or a... No. Richard's voice was sharp enough to cut. Not to protect the house from you. To protect it from me. The coffee shop's background noise. The hiss of the espresso machine. The murmur of other conversations. The indie folk music playing overhead. Seemed to fade away. What? 18 years ago, I made some questionable investments. Properties that looked solid on paper but were built on fraud. Shell companies, falsified inspections, construction shortcuts that should have been illegal. I didn't know at first. I was a silent partner, just a name on contracts and a signature on checks. But when I found out, I didn't report it. I should have, but I didn't because unwinding it would have cost me everything. My reputation, my business, possibly my freedom. He pulled out a handkerchief, actual cloth, monogrammed, and wiped his forehead. His hands were shaking worse now. The properties eventually got investigated. Federal inquiry. People went to jail. I managed to stay out of it, but barely. My lawyers made deals, paid settlements, buried evidence. And one of the conditions of my, let's call it immunity, was that any assets in my name could be seized if new evidence emerged. It was a sword hanging over my head for years. Why are you telling me this? I asked, but part of me was starting to understand, and the understanding was making my chest tight. I put the house in Vanessa's name to protect it from my mistakes, Richard said quietly. If the investigation had gone differently, if they'd come after my assets, the mansion would have been safe because it wasn't mine. It was hers. Clean title, separate from my legal troubles. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But that investigation ended years ago. It did. Richard pushed the envelope toward me. Which is why what's in here is going to change everything. I stared at the envelope. It looked innocuous. Just another manila folder, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times on construction sites and in office buildings. But my hands were shaking as I reached for it. Inside were documents. Legal documents, notarized and official. I read the first page once, then again, then a third time because my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Property deed amendment. Transfer of title. Executed June 14, 2009. The day of my wedding. I don't understand, I said, but I was starting to. God help me, I was starting to. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. The prenup said the house was in Vanessa's name, and legally it was. But what you didn't know, what Vanessa didn't know until recently, was that 6 months after the wedding, when the legal threats against me had passed, I amended the deed. I added your name to the title, David. 50-50 ownership. You and Vanessa both. The coffee shop spun. I gripped the edge of the table. That's impossible. The judge just ruled. The judge ruled based on the prenuptial agreement and the information Vanessa's lawyers provided, Richard said. They submitted the original deed, the one from 2009. They didn't know about the amendment because I never told anyone. I kept it in my private files, meaning to give it to you both as an anniversary gift someday. But then Margaret, Vanessa's mother, got sick, and everything became about her treatment and then her death, and I never did it. And over the years, I convinced myself it didn't matter. You two were solid. You'd be married forever. The paperwork was just paperwork. But we're not married anymore, I said, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. And that paperwork means, it means you own half that house, Richard finished. Always have. The divorce settlement is invalid. The mansion can't be awarded solely to Vanessa because she was never the sole owner. I looked down at the documents again. My name, David Sullivan, right there in black and white. 50% ownership. Dated and notarized. Legal and binding. Why? The question came out broken. Why are you telling me this now? Why not during the divorce proceedings? Why not months ago when this all started? Richard's face crumpled. Because she's my daughter. Because even though I knew this was wrong, even though I watched you lose everything in that courtroom yesterday, some part of me was still trying to protect her. Still hoping maybe you'd just walk away. Take your business and start over and let her have the house because it's all she has left of her mother, of the life we built together. All she has left? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make other patrons look over. Richard, that house isn't just Vanessa's. I built it with my own hands. I renovated every room. I know. He stood too slower, older. I know what you put into that place. I watched you do it. And that's why I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Last night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about your face in that courtroom, about how you looked when the judge ruled, and I realized I'd become the kind of man my father raised me not to be. A coward. Someone who protects his own comfort over doing what's right. He put his hand on my shoulder, and his grip was surprisingly strong despite the tremor. I'm giving you these documents because they're yours. They always were. What you do with them is your choice. You can file them with the court, overturn the settlement, claim what's legally yours. Or you can walk away, let Vanessa keep the house, and pretend you never saw these papers. That's not a choice, I said. That's $3.1 million. Half the value of that estate. It's more than money, Richard said. It's validation. Proof that you weren't just some contractor who married above his station. Proof that I saw you as family, as someone worthy of equal ownership. Proof that your work, your investment, your 15 years mattered. He pulled his hand away and stepped back. I've told you the truth. What happens now is up to you. But David, whatever you decide, you should know. Vanessa doesn't know about this yet. When I told her I needed to meet with you, she thought I was just saying goodbye, giving you some fatherly advice about moving on. If you choose to file these documents, it's going to destroy her. She'll see it as the ultimate betrayal from both of us. She'll see the truth, I corrected, that her father never trusted her with full ownership. That I've been a co-owner all along and nobody bothered to tell me. Yes, Richard agreed quietly. She'll see that too. He left money on the table for both our coffees, more than necessary, and turned to leave. Then he paused at the door and looked back. For what it's worth, I always liked you, David. Thought you were too good for this world we live in, this world of prenups and lawyers and assets. You believed in handshakes and hard work and trust. I admired that. Still do. But I'm also old enough to know that admiration doesn't pay the bills or heal the wounds. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with documents that rewrote my entire history, that transformed me from a divorce contractor who'd lost everything into a man who'd owned it all along and never knew. I sat back down, my coffee long cold, and read through every page. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. The house at 1847 Blackwood Estate Drive belonged 50% to Vanessa and Hartwell and 50% to David James Sullivan. Had since July 2009. Would until one of us sold our share or died or otherwise transferred ownership. Outside the window, people walked past living their ordinary lives, unaware that inside this coffee shop, one man's world had just inverted itself. I thought about Vanessa, about how she'd sat in that courtroom yesterday looking victorious and vindicated. I thought about her attorney's smug presentation, the way they'd painted me as someone who'd benefited from the Hartwell generosity but contributed nothing of real value. I thought about the judge's ruling, the gavel striking, the finality of it all. Except it hadn't been final. It had been wrong. Built on incomplete information, on documents that told half the story. My phone buzzed. A text from James, my foreman and best friend. "How you holding up, brother?" I stared at the message, unsure how to answer. How was I holding up? I'd walked into this coffee shop thinking I knew who I was. A divorced man. A failed husband. Someone who'd built everything and lost it all through naivety and misplaced trust. Now I wasn't sure who I was at all. I gathered the documents, put them back in the envelope, and walked out into the November afternoon. The sun was out despite yesterday's rain, and the city gleamed wet and clean, like it had been washed of its sins. I had a choice to make, and whatever I chose would define not just my future, but the kind of man I wanted to be. The kind of man who fights for what's his, or the kind who walks away. The kind who demands justice, or the kind who chooses peace. The kind my father had been, honorable to a fault even when honor cost him everything, or something different. Something harder. I got in my truck, set the envelope on the passenger seat, and drove toward my rented apartment with no idea what I was going to do. But I had 30 days to collect my belongings from the mansion. 30 days to decide who David Sullivan really was. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to the construction site on Wellington Avenue, where my crew was finishing a commercial renovation, converting an old textile mill into boutique lofts. The kind of project I loved most. Taking something broken and forgotten and making it beautiful again. James was on the second floor when I arrived, reviewing blueprints with Miguel. They both looked up as I climbed the temporary stairs, and I could see the question in James's eyes. He'd texted me twice more since I'd ignored his first message. "Hey, boss," Miguel said, tactfully excusing himself. "I'll go check on the electrical." James waited until Miguel was out of earshot, then crossed his arms. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." I walked to the window, looked out at the city below. From here, you could see the gentrification spreading like a slow tide. Old buildings becoming new, working-class neighborhoods transforming into up-and-coming areas, history being renovated into profit. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When you thought about me and Vanessa, what did you see?" "Honest answer." James was quiet for a moment. We'd known each other since we were 17, had worked side by side for over 15 years. If anyone would tell me the truth, it was him. "I saw you trying really hard," he said finally. "I saw her expecting you to try. And I kept thinking, why does the trying only go one direction?" "What do you mean?" "David, you rebuilt that entire mansion for her. Custom everything. You worked yourself half to death to afford the life she wanted. And I never once saw her compromise on anything. Never saw her say, 'Hey, maybe we don't need Italian marble.' Or, 'Maybe we should take a smaller house and you could work fewer hours.' She didn't force me to do any of that." "No," James agreed. "But she sure as hell never stopped you either. And when you were killing yourself to build her dreams, where was she?" "Really?" I didn't have an answer for that. "Why are you asking?" James pressed. "What happened at the courthouse yesterday was brutal, man. But it's over. Clean break, time to move on. Isn't it?" I thought about the envelope in my truck. What if it's not over? What does that mean? I told him everything. About Richard's confession. About the amended deed. About the choice I was now facing. James listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something close to anger. "Are you kidding me?" he exploded when I finished. "David, this changes everything. You own half that house. You always have. You need to file these documents immediately. Get a new lawyer if Margaret can't handle it. And what?" I cut him off. "Drag this out for another year? More court battles. More lawyers. More watching my life get picked apart in front of strangers." "It's not about the fight," James insisted. "It's about what's right. That house is legally half yours. Vanessa and her lawyers lied to the court, even if they didn't know it. They didn't lie. They just didn't know the full truth. That's the same thing in a courtroom. James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. Look, I get it. You're tired. You've been through hell. But you can't just give away $3.1 million because you're exhausted. It's not about the money. Then what is it about? I looked at my hands again. These hands that had built everything, lost everything, and now apparently owned more than I'd realized. It's about who I want to be when this is finally over, I said quietly. Do I want to be the guy who fought his ex-wife for another year over a house neither of us can live in peacefully? Or do I want to be someone who can walk away and build something new? Those aren't the only options, James said. You could file the documents, force a real settlement, one where you get what you're actually owed, and then still walk away if you want.